Let's chat about how Iran and Saudi Arabia have been playing a high-stakes game in the Middle East using proxy forces, and what that really means in today's world. Both Iran and Saudi Arabia are major regional powers with very different visions for the Middle East. Over the past few decades, instead of confronting each other directly, which would risk a full-blown war, they've chosen to support different groups, governments, and militias across several countries. This approach is what we call proxy warfare, and it's a bit like watching two players in a video game control characters on the field, rather than battling head-to-head. Starting with Iran, its influence in the region largely comes from a mix of ideology, historical ties, and strategic ambitions. Iran has a significant Shia identity, and it uses that to rally support among Shia groups in countries like Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. For instance, Iran's backing of Hezbollah in Lebanon isn't just about having an armed group on its doorstep, it's about extending its influence, creating a deterrent against its adversaries, and shaping regional policies that align with its interests. Iran believes that by building these alliances, it can counterbalance the power of the United States and its allies, as well as that of Saudi Arabia. On the flip side, Saudi Arabia has been using its own version of proxy power, but with a different focus. As a leading Sunni power, Saudi Arabia sees itself as the guardian of Sunni Islam and has often been at odds with Iranian expansion. To maintain its influence, Saudi Arabia supports various Sunni groups and governments across the region. In Syria, for example, while the dynamics are incredibly complex, Saudi Arabia's involvement has included financial and logistical support to factions that oppose both the Assad regime and Iranian influence. In Yemen, the Saudi-led coalition has been fighting against the Houthi movement, which is seen as an extension of Iranian power there. By doing so, Saudi Arabia aims to check Iranian influence and maintain its own sway over the strategic balance in the region. What makes this proxy battle particularly interesting is how it's less about direct confrontation and more about subtle, sometimes shadowy, influence. Instead of deploying huge armies to fight each other directly, Iran and Saudi Arabia invest in local groups that can fight on their behalf. This method often leads to prolonged conflicts in countries that are already struggling with instability. You might hear terms like sectarian divide or regional hegemony tossed around, but at the core, it's about both powers trying to secure a strategic edge without crossing the line into full-scale war. Another layer to this rivalry is the economic and energy dimensions. The Middle East is home to some of the world's largest oil reserves, and controlling or influencing the governments in this region means having a say in global energy supplies. Saudi Arabia, as one of the biggest oil producers, has a vested interest in keeping the region stable in a way that favors its economic model. Iran, despite facing sanctions and economic pressures, also wants to leverage its geographic and political position to ensure it remains a key player in global energy politics. Proxy wars and local alliances are tools to ensure that each side can safeguard its interests, be it energy supplies, political influence, or even cultural leadership. It's also important to note that this battle for influence isn't happening in isolation. Global powers like the United States, Russia, and even some European countries have their own interests in the Middle East, and they often end up playing supporting roles for one side or the other. This makes the situation even more complicated, as local conflicts can sometimes escalate into broader regional or even international confrontations. What does all of this mean for everyday people in the region? Unfortunately, proxy wars often translate into prolonged instability, economic hardships, and even humanitarian crises. In countries like Yemen and Syria, where proxy battles have contributed to ongoing conflicts, civilians bear the brunt of the violence and instability. Infrastructure is damaged, economies suffer, and communities are displaced. Meanwhile, the larger strategic goals of Iran and Saudi Arabia continue, largely untouched by the suffering of ordinary citizens. In summary, the control of the Middle East through proxy forces by Iran and Saudi Arabia is a complex and multifaceted strategy. Both countries use local allies to extend their influence without engaging in direct military conflict, each promoting their own ideological and strategic interests. While this approach helps them avoid the immediate risks of a direct war, it often comes at a high cost for the stability and well-being of the region. It's a reminder of how regional power struggles can have far-reaching consequences, affecting not just political borders but the daily lives of millions of people caught in the crossfire.